The story of German unification doesn't begin with parades and flags. It begins in the fog of confusion, an awkward maze of dozens of kingdoms, duchies, electorates, and city-states that made up the German Confederation after the fall of Napoleon. It was 1815, and the Congress of Vienna had just patched together a shaky Europe, like gluing broken porcelain and hoping no one touched it too hard. Among the chaos stood two giants, Austria, clinging tightly to centuries of empire, and Prussia, smaller, colder, and more focused than most noticed at the time. For centuries, the lands we now call Germany weren't a country. They were a cultural idea, a shared language, overlapping traditions and common myths, but politically, they were a jigsaw puzzle of ambition and old grudges. In this world, kings ruled over patches of farmland, traders spoke in dialects, and a train from Berlin to Frankfurt could pass through 5 or 6 different tariffs. Everyone claimed to be German, yet no one could agree on what that meant. And yet, beneath the surface, things were stirring. Industrialization crept in like steam hissing from under a heavy lid. Railroads began connecting cities. Middle-class merchants started talking about shared prosperity. Students in smoky beer halls toasted to a united Germany, though they might have been just as excited about the beer. In the cities, newspapers printed poems about unity and songs of old Teutonic heroes. Nationalism had begun whispering in people's ears. At the same time, the German Confederation itself was little more than a diplomatic umbrella. Created by the victors of the Napoleonic Wars, it was designed more to prevent trouble than to enable progress. Led by Austria, it was conservative, cautious, and allergic to change. But Prussia, larger, more militarized, and blessed with natural resources, wasn't as content with the status quo. Prussia had a peculiar advantage: efficiency. Its military, its bureaucracy, even its schools, all functioned with a cool, calculated purpose. The Prussian king might not have ruled over the most glamorous court, but he had iron in his spine and maps on his mind. Still, in the early 1800s, few thought of Prussia as a future unifier. It was admired, yes, but feared and sometimes even mocked by the southern German states for its stiffness and stern Protestant ways. Meanwhile, Austria was the proud old lion, stretching from northern Italy to the Balkans, speaking dozens of languages within its borders. Vienna was a center of art, culture, and conservative diplomacy. And it had no intention of letting some northern upstart take control of the German-speaking world. In 1834, however, something happened that would tilt the balance ever so slightly: the Zollverein. It was a customs union, a trade agreement between most of the German states that eliminated internal tariffs and created a shared economic zone. Austria was pointedly excluded. Prussia led it, and slowly, the flow of money, goods, and railroads began weaving a more united economic fabric. Even if political unity was unthinkable, economic unity had a logic too strong to resist. That logic grew stronger as revolutions rocked Europe in 1848. Inspired by the French, students and workers poured into the streets of German cities, demanding constitutions, freedom of the press, and, most dangerously for the old order, a unified German nation. For a brief moment, it seemed the dream might come to life. The Frankfurt Parliament gathered and offered the crown of a united Germany to the King of Prussia, Frederick William IV. He refused it, famously declaring he wouldn't accept a crown from the gutter. The moment passed, the revolutions failed, and the old powers regained control. But something had changed. Though the uprising collapsed, it left behind a trail of shaken rulers, wiser revolutionaries, and a realization: the idea of German unity wasn't going away. It would not be handed to idealists or dreamed into being. It would need to be fought for, maneuvered, and perhaps taken. Through the 1850s, Austria tried to maintain its grip, but its empire was stretched thin. It had too many languages to juggle, too many borders to defend, and too little focus. Prussia, meanwhile, sharpened its tools. It watched, waited, and built. And then, in the shadows of this shifting balance, a man named Otto von Bismarck took his first careful steps toward the center stage. But that's for a little later. So here stood the German world by mid-century, culturally intertwined, economically cooperating, politically fragmented, and simmering with tension. It was like a kettle that had been placed over a fire, still intact, but warming fast. The idea of Germany was no longer just for poets. It had become a question of power. While Austria still reveled in its imperial glow, balls in Vienna, diplomacy at grand oak tables, and the glint of medals on aging generals, Prussia was changing gears. Quietly. Methodically. It wasn't the grand speeches or fanfare that made the difference. It was the trains, the factories, the textbooks and classrooms. By the 1850s and into the 1860s, Prussia was no longer just a northern kingdom with a strong army. It was becoming the most efficient engine of power in the German-speaking world. At the heart of this transformation was the bureaucracy, clean, disciplined, and ruthlessly organized. From local tax collectors to the officers of the Prussian army, everything ran like clockwork. Military service was mandatory, and that meant nearly every able-bodied man received training, discipline, and a shared sense of identity that began to override local loyalties. Then there was education. The Prussians didn't just teach reading and arithmetic. They taught order, loyalty, and the subtle seeds of nationalism. In Prussian schools, maps showed not just kingdoms, but the territories where German was spoken. In literature, students read about Arminius, the ancient warrior who defeated the Romans. The message was clear: Germans were one people, scattered now, but perhaps destined to be whole again. Railways played their part too. They linked cities that had once been weeks apart by muddy roads. Now a soldier from Cologne could be in Berlin in a matter of hours. A factory owner in Hanover could ship goods to Breslau without paying half a dozen tolls. This was the physical stitching of unity. Every mile of track laid by Prussia was also a mile of shared identity. And crucially, these railways were built with military precision. War, if it came, would move fast. And yet, Prussia never loudly declared its ambitions. It let Austria do the talking while it did the building. It avoided confrontation while securing influence. The Zollverein expanded, now including nearly all the German states except Austria. And Prussia made itself indispensable, its economic leadership drawing even the southern states, wary of Prussian power, into its orbit. Austria, meanwhile, was beginning to buckle. The empire had too many priorities and not enough cohesion. In 1859, it suffered a bruising defeat in Italy at the hands of the rising Kingdom of Sardinia and its French allies. The loss shook Vienna. Its army, long considered one of Europe's finest, had stumbled. Nationalist movements inside the empire's own borders, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, began making more noise. The old Habsburg dream of a multi-ethnic empire was fraying. Into this tension stepped a trio of men in Prussia who would soon reshape history. The first was King Wilhelm I, a stern and sensible man, more soldier than politician. He believed in a strong army and didn't trust liberals or dreamers. The second was Helmuth von Moltke, a military genius who revolutionized planning and strategy. And the third, Otto von Bismarck, was still waiting in the wings. But even before Bismarck's rise to power, Prussia was already testing its strength. It modernized its army, introduced new rifles, adopted breech-loading artillery, and practiced large-scale mobilization. Austria, slow to reform, stuck to older methods and more traditional tactics. The gap between the two militaries was widening, not visibly, perhaps, but dangerously. Diplomatically, Prussia remained cautious. It didn't insult Austria or claim leadership outright. But it acted with quiet confidence. Treaties were signed, influence spread, and the Zollverein tightened its economic web. German states that once leaned toward Vienna found themselves doing more business with Berlin. In 1861, Wilhelm I became king after the death of his brother. He inherited a powerful kingdom, but also a constitutional crisis. The Prussian parliament resisted his military budget. Liberals demanded limits on royal authority. And just as tensions threatened to boil over, the king appointed Otto von Bismarck as minister-president in 1862. It was a gamble. Bismarck was known for his wit, his boldness, and his contempt for idealists. He was a master of manipulation, a man who understood power not as a theory but as a tool. In his very first speech to Parliament, Bismarck laid down his philosophy. The great questions of the day will not be decided by speeches and majority decisions, but by iron and blood. It wasn't just rhetoric. It was a warning. From here, Prussia stopped being merely the patient reformer and began playing offense. It still spoke softly, but now it carried a saber, and it was prepared to use it. And the timing couldn't have been better. The Austrian Empire was recovering from defeat in Italy and trying to maintain a grip on its internal divisions. It still held prestige, yes, but its grasp was weakening. Prussia saw an opening, not for immediate conquest, but for strategic advantage. If it could move carefully, provoke wisely, and win quickly, it might just take Austria's place as the leader of German affairs. All the pieces were being placed on the board. And the man who would soon make the first move had just taken his seat. Otto von Bismarck was no romantic. He didn't wave flags or give stirring speeches to cheering crowds. He was a chess player, cold, methodical, and ruthless when he had to be. When Bismarck became minister-president of Prussia in 1862, he inherited a nation ripe for change and a continent still tiptoeing around the memory of Napoleon. What he saw was opportunity. And he intended to seize it, not through ideology, but through calculated moves that would reshape Europe. His first challenge was domestic. The Prussian parliament, dominated by liberals, refused to approve the king's military budget. They feared absolutism and resented the idea of a growing standing army. Bismarck brushed them aside. He used funds without approval, arguing that where the law was vague, the government must act in the state's interest. It was a bold, and borderline illegal, move. But it worked. The army was modernized, expanded, and drilled to perfection. Bismarck knew that to unify Germany under Prussian leadership, he couldn't just declare it. That would rally opposition. Instead, he would provoke crises, small, winnable wars that would isolate enemies, rally national pride, and make Prussia indispensable. The first test came with Denmark. Two small duchies, Schleswig and Holstein, became the spark. These were territories on the Danish-German border with mixed populations. The Danish king tried to absorb Schleswig fully into Denmark, violating previous agreements. German nationalists were outraged. And Bismarck? He saw a chance. But he needed an ally. He turned to Austria. It was a masterstroke. By convincing Austria to join Prussia and defending the rights of the German Confederation in the duchies, Bismarck gained legitimacy. Austria couldn't say no without looking weak. And so, in 1864, the Austro-Prussian alliance declared war on Denmark. It was a swift, decisive conflict. The Danish army stood no chance. Within months, Denmark was forced to cede both Schleswig and Holstein. Now came the real game. Austria took control of Holstein. Prussia took Schleswig. A joint victory, yes, but also a setup. Bismarck had engineered a situation where conflict between Austria and Prussia was almost inevitable. Each governed a neighboring duchy, each suspicious of the other's intentions. Bismarck began to stir the pot, subtly. He tightened control in Schleswig. He accused Austria of mismanaging Holstein. He waited. Behind the scenes, he moved fast. He secured neutrality from Russia. He soothed France with vague promises. He reassured Italy, and then made a deal. If war came, Prussia would support Italy's claim to Venetia, held by Austria. Italy agreed to join Prussia if a war broke out. Bismarck was encircling Austria with smiles and handshakes. But he needed one more thing: justification. He found it in 1866. Austria, frustrated by Prussian provocations in Schleswig, brought the issue before the German Confederation. This was exactly what Bismarck wanted. He declared Austria's move a violation of their agreement and a threat to Prussian interests. Prussian troops marched into Holstein. The war had begun. The Austro-Prussian War, sometimes called the 7 Weeks' War, was swift and brutal. Prussia had the edge in every way: better weapons, faster mobilization, superior command under Moltke, and a network of railroads that delivered troops with frightening speed. Austria still relied on traditional formations and slow communications. The result was inevitable. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Königgrätz in July 1866. Prussian forces flanked the Austrian army, catching it off guard and routing it in a matter of hours. The scale of the victory stunned Europe. Austria was humbled. Vienna itself was under threat. But here, Bismarck did something unexpected. He stopped. King Wilhelm wanted to press forward, to march into Austria and crush it completely. Bismarck said no. A weakened Austria was useful. A destroyed Austria? That would only frighten the rest of Europe and invite chaos. He wanted peace, on Prussian terms. The Treaty of Prague followed. Austria was excluded from German affairs. The German Confederation was dissolved. In its place, Prussia created the North German Confederation, 21 states united under its leadership, with Bismarck pulling the strings. Austria slinked back to its own empire, licking its wounds. This was Bismarck's genius. He didn't need to conquer all of Germany at once. He just needed to remove the biggest rival and make Prussia the indispensable center of power for the northern states. And he'd done exactly that. But southern Germany remained outside his grasp. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, these Catholic, culturally distinct states still hesitated. They feared Protestant Prussian dominance. They were loyal to their own traditions. And crucially, they weren't yet ready to be unified. Bismarck knew he couldn't force them in, not yet. But he also knew something else: nothing unites people like a common enemy. And he had just the one in mind. In the summer of 1866, with Austria wounded and the northern German states now tied to Prussia through the North German Confederation, Bismarck could have rested. But resting wasn't in his nature. He knocked Austria off the board, gained military prestige, and shown Prussia's dominance. Still, the game wasn't over. There were pieces left: southern Germany, the hesitant states that hadn't yet bought into the idea of unification under Prussian rule. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt, traditional, Catholic, and wary of Protestant power from the north. These states shared language and culture with their northern cousins, but history and religion pulled them in different directions. They valued their independence. Their rulers enjoyed their titles and their courts. Most importantly, they didn't trust that Prussian power wouldn't steamroll their traditions. Bismarck knew they couldn't be bribed or bullied, not directly. They needed something stronger to bind them to Berlin. Enter Denmark, again. Not for a war this time, but as a reminder. After the Schleswig-Holstein conflict and the humbling of Austria, southern Germans had seen what Prussia could do. But fear alone wouldn't bring them closer. Bismarck needed unity, not submission. And unity needed emotion. So he turned his attention to the west, to France. France under Napoleon III was watching nervously. The collapse of Austrian influence in Germany had shifted the balance of power. France, long the giant across the Rhine, was suddenly faced with a stronger, more organized German bloc to its east. Napoleon III didn't like what he saw. He tried to assert himself. He demanded compensation for Prussia's gains. Bismarck played coy. He offered nothing. Tensions rose. Then came the perfect trigger: the Spanish throne. In 1868, Spain's Queen Isabella was deposed, and the country went searching for a new monarch. One candidate was Leopold of Hohenzollern, related to the Prussian royal family. France saw this as encirclement, Hohenzollerns to the east and west. Napoleon III was furious. He sent a demand that Prussia withdraw its support for Leopold. Wilhelm I, the Prussian king, agreed, peacefully. But that wasn't enough for France. They wanted public guarantees. They wanted to humiliate Prussia on the international stage. That's when Bismarck stepped in. The king sent a telegram from EMS, explaining the situation. Bismarck edited it. He didn't add lies, just trimmed, rearranged, and sharpened the tone. The new version made it seem as if the French ambassador had insulted Wilhelm, and that Wilhelm had snubbed him in return. It was cold, dismissive, and above all, provocative. He released the edited telegram to the press. France exploded. Newspapers demanded war. Napoleon III, already politically fragile at home, gave in to public pressure. On July 19, 1870, France declared war on Prussia. Exactly as Bismarck had hoped. Now the real magic began. Southern German states, once wary of Prussia, were horrified. France had attacked a German king. The French threat was no longer theoretical. It was on the move. Overnight, fears of Prussian dominance faded. What mattered was protecting German soil. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, all declared war alongside Prussia. German soldiers, north and south, marched together. Flags flew. Anthems played. The other was no longer each other, it was France. A shared enemy had forged a shared cause. And Prussia was ready. Moltke's military machine, refined over the years, moved with terrifying precision. German forces were modern, mobile, and well coordinated. France, despite its proud army, was disorganized and poorly led. Napoleon III, hoping for a quick victory, found himself cornered in the fortress of Sedan in September. He surrendered personally. It was a moment of shock and triumph. France humiliated. Prussia ascended. And in the south, German pride swelled. For the first time, people in Munich, Stuttgart, and Karlsruhe spoke not just of their towns, but of Germany. Real Germany. But the war wasn't over. A new French Republic rose in Paris, refusing to surrender. The German armies laid siege to the city through the bitter winter. Paris starved. Shells fell. Still, they resisted. And then, in the cold halls of the Palace of Versailles, France's symbol of royal glory, came the final stroke. On January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors, Wilhelm I was proclaimed Emperor, Kaiser, of a united Germany. Princes and generals stood together. Southern states had agreed to join the new empire. The dream, once fragile and fractured, had become flesh and blood. And Bismarck, standing slightly apart, must have known this wasn't just a victory. It was the birth of a new power. The German Empire, forged through diplomacy, war, and no small amount of manipulation, now stood at the center of Europe. Not because people agreed in quiet rooms, but because Bismarck had made them choose between unity or defeat. The price had been high, lives lost, alliances broken, traditions shattered, but the result was undeniable. The German puzzle had been solved. Not by poets or philosophers, but by iron and blood. As the echoes of celebration faded from the Hall of Mirrors and the Kaiser's crown gleamed under the chandeliers of Versailles, a new era began. But beneath the triumph lay questions about power, identity, and the very nature of the empire Bismarck had created. Germany, at last, was unified. But what did that really mean? The new German Empire, born in 1871, was not a seamless nation. It was a federal structure, a patchwork stitched tighter than before, yes, but still with seams visible to those who knew where to look. At its core was Prussia, which now comprised more than 60% of the empire's population and land. It had the largest army, the most industrial power, and its king was now the emperor. The southern states, though included, still guarded their customs, religious identities, and royal traditions. Bavaria retained its own postal system and peacetime army command. Württemberg and Baden had negotiated similar privileges. The unification had not erased local pride, it had redirected it. And there, in the middle of it all, stood Bismarck. No longer just Prussia's chancellor, he was now the first chancellor of the German Empire. But his title belied the complexity of his role. He remained the strategist, the weaver of wires and alliances, and the silent hand behind the emperor. And he knew better than anyone that unification was not the endgame, it was merely a new board. Outside Germany, the world reacted with awe and anxiety. In just 7 years, Bismarck had taken a minor European kingdom and transformed it into a continental empire. France, humiliated, now festered with resentment. Austria, pushed aside, reeled from the blow and turned east, tightening its grip on its Slavic territories. Britain watched from across the Channel, wondering how this new power might shift the delicate balance of Europe. And Russia, well, Russia nodded silently, already thinking 2 moves ahead. But inside Germany, something else was happening: transformation. With unification came a sense of purpose. German industry boomed. Coal and steel production soared. Railroads stretched like arteries across the empire. A new generation of Germans, born into the empire, not the Confederation, grew up singing the same anthem and saluting the same flag. Nationalism, once a whisper in taverns and lecture halls, became a school subject, a newspaper headline, a family toast. Yet the shadows of Bismarck's methods lingered. He hadn't united Germany through votes and referenda. He'd done it through war, fear, and manipulation. And so, the empire he helped create bore some of that hardness. There were tensions between Catholics and Protestants, between industrialists and agrarians, between the modern cities of the Rhineland and the rural traditions of East Prussia. Bismarck saw these tensions not as threats, but as opportunities to control. He launched the Kulturkampf, a cultural struggle, aimed at reducing the political power of the Catholic Church. It backfired. Southern Catholics rallied, and Bismarck eventually pulled back. He turned instead to socialists, whom he considered dangerous dreamers. And yet, in a twist of genius, he stole their thunder. He introduced social reforms, health insurance, accident insurance, old age pensions, not out of compassion, but out of calculation. If workers could be loyal to the empire, perhaps they wouldn't listen to revolutionary voices. And so the strange pattern of Bismarckian rule continued: suppress and support, manipulate and mend, provoke and pacify. Always one step ahead. Meanwhile, the emperor, Wilhelm I, remained a figurehead of stability. He had little taste for politics, trusting Bismarck to handle the affairs of state. Their relationship was built on mutual respect, if not warmth. Wilhelm saw Bismarck as necessary. Bismarck saw Wilhelm as useful. But empires are rarely static. Power breeds restlessness. As the 1870s wore on, German identity hardened. It was no longer enough to be a collection of Germans, it had to mean something. And that something was increasingly tied to military strength, cultural pride, and a sense of destiny. Berlin grew into a true capital. Universities churned out engineers, chemists, and lawyers who would fuel the empire's engines. Factories in the Ruhr lit the sky red with steel sparks. The German mark became a symbol of new economic confidence. But through all this, Bismarck remained cautious. He had no desire for further wars. His goal now was stability, to protect what had been built. He forged new alliances, balanced relationships with Austria, courted Russia, and kept France isolated. Peace, to him, was not kindness, it was strategy. Because Bismarck understood something that many of his contemporaries didn't: war had unified Germany, yes, but it could just as easily tear it apart. So he became the empire's guardian, not of ideals, but of equilibrium. His genius had created the empire. Now his discipline had to preserve it. And yet, he could already sense that time was slipping. New voices were rising, more aggressive, less cautious. Nationalism had once been his tool. Now it was becoming a flame others wished to wield. The unification of Germany had changed everything. Europe had a new center. The continent had a new rhythm. The chessboard had been flipped. And the man who had set it all in motion was beginning to wonder who would make the next move. The German Empire had risen swiftly, as if summoned by force of will, and by force of arms. But empires, no matter how sturdy they seem, live on a delicate balance. Otto von Bismarck understood this better than anyone. And as the final years of his chancellorship approached, he worked not just to guard the empire's borders, but to defend its spirit from the very passions that had brought it into being. By 1880, the empire was booming. Coal, iron, railways, and trade surged across the Reich. German engineering was winning awards. German universities were attracting talent. German soldiers marched with unmatched precision. But behind the curtain of prosperity, cracks were forming. Nationalism, once a tool of unification, had become an emotion in its own right, unpredictable, aggressive, and loud. Young Germans, who had never known the fragmented world of kingdoms and duchies, now chanted slogans about destiny and greatness. Some believed Germany's unification was not an end, but a beginning, an opening chapter in a larger, more ambitious story of European leadership, even domination. Bismarck wanted none of that. He had forged an empire to secure peace and stability. Expansionist fantasies, he feared, would undo everything. And so, with remarkable foresight, he pursued a foreign policy of restraint. He built a system of alliances: the League of the Three Emperors with Austria and Russia, the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary, and later the reinsurance treaty with Russia. His goal: keep France isolated, Russia calm, and Austria close. He didn't care about grand ideals, only about maintaining balance. He wasn't a dreamer. He was a mechanic, fine-tuning a powerful but fragile engine. Domestically, Bismarck continued to play chess with German society. He crushed socialist uprisings with one hand, then passed groundbreaking welfare laws with the other. He made sure the press was watched, the army funded, and the bureaucracy loyal. He believed in authority, not because he loved power, but because he feared what would happen without it. But Germany was changing. A new generation of politicians, industrialists, and officers were rising, men who hadn't fought the wars of unification, who hadn't seen the cost of empire building firsthand. They admired Bismarck, yes, but they were no longer content to follow in his shadow. They wanted a louder Germany. A prouder one. One that claimed its place in the sun. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1888, Kaiser Wilhelm I died. He had been the old anchor, stoic, measured, and content to let Bismarck rule in all but name. His successor, Frederick III, was a liberal at heart but gravely ill. He reigned for only 99 days before succumbing to cancer. Then came Wilhelm II. The young Kaiser was bold, ambitious, and deeply insecure. He wanted to be remembered, not as a passive monarch, but as a dynamic force. Bismarck, to him, was a relic. A towering figure, yes, but also an obstacle to his own vision. Their relationship soured quickly. Wilhelm II wanted more control, more grandeur, more global standing. Bismarck urged caution. He still remembered the fires of 1866 and 1870. He still believed in diplomacy before danger. But the world had changed. And so had the mood. In 1890, after months of tension, Kaiser Wilhelm II demanded Bismarck's resignation. The Iron Chancellor, the architect of modern Germany, stepped down in bitterness and disappointment. He retired to his estate, still writing, still watching, still warning that the empire must avoid blunders into war. But without him, the restraints loosened. Wilhelm II soon abandoned many of Bismarck's careful policies. He let the alliance with Russia lapse, opening the door for Franco-Russian cooperation. He pursued naval expansion, challenging British dominance at sea. He wrapped himself in uniforms, parades, and speeches. Germany, once the cautious power, began to stride with heavier boots. Bismarck lived long enough to see it. In the shadows of his estate, he watched Europe's alliances shift, nationalism boil over, and militarism grow bolder. He died in 1898, aged 83, respected, remembered, but increasingly ignored. And the empire he had created? It stood strong, for a time. But the tensions Bismarck had once held in check began to clash. Within less than 2 decades, the continent would descend into the catastrophe of World War I. The very unity that had seemed like Germany's triumph became the foundation for its most destructive chapter. Still, the legacy of Bismarck and the unification of the German states remains one of the most breathtaking political achievements in European history. It was not just about borders or flags, it was about power, timing, and the art of shaping destiny. It showed that nations are not always born from consensus. Sometimes they are forged in the heat of conflict, shaped by cunning minds, and driven by a relentless vision. Germany had become one, militarily, politically, economically. But the questions that followed, about what kind of nation it would be, how it would use its strength, and how long it could hold together, those would echo for generations. And it all began with a patchwork of kingdoms, a few quiet reforms, and a man who believed that speeches were fine, but iron and blood were better.